Hey, Dany.
Yeah.
Have you ever done research? Have you ever done research at the library?
Yes, I would. Yeah, that's what I research every week for this show.
So I went to the library one time and did a big research on trans history. And in 2019, I learned about these people called the Mattachine Society. And I wrote a song about it.
Hey, Claire, guess what?
What?
It just so happens we're talking about Mattachine today.
What?
You're listening to .fam.
Welcome to .fam. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
That was a loud scream.
It really was.
I didn't peek. It didn't peek.
Well, all right.
I'm Claire.
And like I said, today we're talking about the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. So,
Nice. Excellent.
which
That's going to be great.
I think for the first time in this show's history, you know what we're talking about.
I know. Well, that's not necessarily true. Stonewall and some of the other people,
that's true.
Like Leslie
You
Feinberg.
knew about
like,
Stonewall.
Yeah, but I did know Stonewall. I did know Stonewall deeply, but I've heard of many of the others, but didn't know the story.
Right.
I still really liked the French Spy. That was my favorite story.
Chevalier.
And I think what episode was that one?
3.
And you can find that on episode 3. That one was really cool.
Well, let's get into it.
Yeah.
The Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, they were part of the Homophile movement of the late 40s through early 60s.
For those who don't know, homophile was a term used predominantly in the 1940s through the 1960s to try and de-emphasize the sexual aspect of homosexuality. And we've talked about him too. I don't know if you know about this, but it was Hirschfeld that coined this term.
Mm-hmm.
I know. It's all woven together, baby. It's all woven together. And the hope was to describe and distinguish people as homophiles and only use the term homosexual to describe sexual activities.
Yeah, that's right.
So they were really trying to separate the two.
Yeah, it was kind of this attempt to make homosexuality feel less, sexual in nature, because it was, very tied to this concept of like sexual deviancy and being different from straight folks. So
Totally.
It was this attempt to like, it's not all about sex, we're about love too, and kind of focusing on that. But like this kind of preoccupation with love and really trying to de-emphasize sexual activity in the homophile movement. Around the 70s, people really started to see this as being, too concerned with like blending in and, trying not to make waves. And folks really thought that like these groups weren't going far enough. But that's jumping ahead. We'll get there.
That's what I heard as well. But anyway, I love the Mattachine Society. I think they really pushed the boundaries, so to speak.
Yeah.
But they don't exist anymore, unfortunately. They disbanded. But we'll get there, as Dany said. We'll get there.
Well, let's start with Mattachine then.
All right.
The Mattachine Society was one of the first gay activist organizations in the United States. We say one of because while there were some gay rights organizations that came before Mattachine, most, if not all of those, were entirely like covert. They were less singularly focused on like gay issues and more just like, civil rights sort of in general, communist issues and whatnot. So Mattachine was founded in 1950 by an American communist, Harry Hay, and communism's going to come up a lot this episode.
Oh, hell yeah.
After about 2 years of refining this idea that Harry Hay had sort of come up with, he finally founded Mattachine in 1950. So,
What happened in those first 2 years? What was the thing about that?
Well, in 1948, Harry Hay was at a party with some other gay men. They were supporting progressive presidential candidate Henry Wallace at the time. And at this party, Hay spoke with a lot of these other attendants about forming a, support organization of predominantly gay men for presidential candidate Wallace. And he wanted to call it Bachelors for Wallace.
Nice.
At the party, a lot of these men were very enthusiastic about the idea, but the following day, Harry found that they were much less enthusiastic. So it may have been liberal libations had loosened some tongues.
Yeah.
So he kind of kept this idea on the back burner and refined it over the next 2 years. And then in late 1950, he officially formed Mattachine Society, which was not called Mattachine at the time. In November 11th, 1950, Mattachine had their very first meeting in Los Angeles. Initially under the name the Society of Fools, which I love that name. Just in general, I think that's a fun name.
I mean, yeah, I guess. Like, I guess in the 1950s, it was probably more tongue-in-cheek than, like, it feels a little demeaning. I'm not going to lie. It feels a little demeaning, like self-deprecating.
I think it was, a little bit of self-deprecation, humor, kind of trying to leaven, provide some levity to the situation, because, this is 1950. Like, gay folks are very ostracized. So I think if you poke fun at yourself, it makes it slightly more like, okay, people might be willing to like give you an extra second to explain.
Yeah.
So I think that might be why. I couldn't find any specific information about why it was originally called the Society of Fools, but that's just kind of my personal read on it.
Well, it seems like somebody else also suggested other names.
Yeah.
And they came up with the Mattachine Society. James Gruber? Is that a pronunciation?
James Gruber.
Gruber, okay.
Yeah. At a meeting later that month, early member James Gruber suggested a couple other names for the group, including the Mattachine Society, which Harry Hay ultimately chose.
And like the Mattachine, I kind of know this. A little bit from my library research.
Yeah, do you? You know what Mattachine actually means, where it comes from?
I know it was French, and I don't know.
Really, way to sell it. Fantastic work.
What does it mean?
You're 100% right. So Mattachine was inspired by, it does come from France, from the French.
Yep.
The name Mattachine was inspired by a French medieval and Renaissance mask group. So
okay.
I don't know if you know what a mask
what's
group
a mask? Like trans mask? What's a mask group?
Mask groups in the
laughter.
Renaissance, mask groups were these kind of traveling groups of masked court performers. I think they originated in Italy in the Italian Renaissance, but they became pretty popular in France around that time as well. And, it was usually these traveling groups of unmarried men who were in these lifelong secret fraternities, and they never performed in public unmasked. Sounds a little queer if you ask me. So, but they would conduct dances and rituals and musical performances, and they would perform for both, nobles at courts, but also, for rural peasants in the countryside, including, like equinox celebrations, pagan type celebrations, like the Feast of Fools, if anyone's seen Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame, that kind of thing.
Oh, interesting.
So
I wonder if they were in that movie.
Well, probably not. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Probably not. They even sometimes led peasant protests against oppression, and when they did that, oftentimes the lord of the region would understandably get pretty pissed at the peasants. So
yeah,
these mass groups who led the uprising kind of acted as a shield, so that the peasants didn't receive the peasants didn't receive the brunt of the Lord's anger. These traveling mass groups did.
Oh, very clever.
Yeah, and so I think that's part of why Harry, kind of wanted to tip the hat to these groups. So the specific group for which the Mattachine Society was named was called the Société Mattachine. And that group, in and of itself, was named after a particular character in Italian theater who was named Mattachino. And Mattachino was like a court jester who always spoke the truth to the king, even when no one else was willing to do so. Nice. Bravery, speaking truth to power, standing up to nobles to protect the peasants. It creates this rich tapestry of inspiration that I think Harry really wanted to, tap into. That's where the name Mattachine comes from. So Mattachine was originally organized very similar to kind of how the Communist Party of the United States was organized. So most of the founders of Mattachine were card-carrying members of the Communist Party of the United States.
That's right. Yep. That's a huge point whenever you read about the Mattachine societies. Like, they always talk about we're card-carrying members.
They were card-carrying members.
All right.
So, and much like the Communist Party, Mattachine originally had, cells. They had oaths of secrecy. There were 5 different levels of membership, and only the leaders of the top member, were like, they governed the whole organization. So it was very kind of communist based. The primary goals of Mattachine when they were formed were to unify gays and homosexuals isolated from their own kind, educate both gays and straight folks alike toward an ethical homosexual culture, lead, they wanted to lead more socially conscious gays to provide leadership to, the whole group of not just other gays, but
they wanted to empower the community and
exactly.
develop like leadership skills within it. That's really cool.
Exactly. And last but not least, to assist gays who are victimized daily as a result of oppression. So originally, Mattachine membership grew pretty slowly to start with, but they received a huge boost in early 1952 when one of the founders, whose last name was Jennings, he was arrested in a Los Angeles park for lewd behavior.
Lewd behavior.
Yeah, if you remember when we're talking about Stonewall or the Compton's cafeteria riots, there were so many of these laws that were so widely interpreted, anti-vagrancy laws that were like 100 years old, that the police would just lean on to, arrest queer folks for no reason. And this was one of them, lewd behavior. So Jennings was arrested for lewd behavior, and the members of the Mattachine Fifth Order, which was that highest secret order of leadership.
Oh, yeah.
They began to publicize Jennings' case. And they tried to use it as a means to address the issue of police entrapment of gay men, but also just kind of like, police overreach and mistreatment in general. Obviously, they didn't want to be super public with Mattachine since it was still kind of operating in this sort of like secrecy communist sort of way. So they generated this publicity around Jennings' case under the name the Citizens Committee to Outlaw Entrapment. And this visibility around the case generated a lot of financial support and a lot of volunteers for Mattachine. So, they really started to see a lot of growth around this time.
This was only 2 years. Already, he's already arrested. That should just tell you, like,
well,
how
of course. I mean, that was
then.
One of the whole reasons that Mattachine came together was because gay men were being arrested constantly. Like, this is not a new issue. Yeah. So, but yeah, the publicity for Jennings' case really, generated this financial and support, and, a lot of volunteers and new members for Mattachine came in. But one of the things that started to really frustrate folks in the Los Angeles and San Francisco area was that Mattachine was very male focused. Right? Like, they wanted to, like we talked about, their whole primary goals was to, like, unify gays in general, but, like, it was really a group for, like, gay men, and gay men was kind of their priority. And this frustrated a lot of gay women. So we end up seeing sort of a sister group pop up called the Daughters of Bilitis. So,
let's go.
And Daughters of Bilitis was the very first lesbian civil and political rights organization in the U.S. If there were others that came before the Daughters, we don't know about them. So from what we understand, the Daughters was the very first lesbian organization. So they were formed in San Francisco in 1955. So, 5 years after Mattachine. And they were initially founded as this kind of secret social club and like an alternative to lesbian bars, which were, subject to frequent police raids and harassment. It's the whole...
Yeah, like you do in 1955,
Yeah, the whole reason Stonewall happened like 14 years later, right?
Yeah.
So there were a couple of lesbians in 1955, Del Martin and her partner Phyllis Lyon. They formed this group after they complained to a pair of gay male friends that they didn't know any other lesbians in the area and there wasn't really a group for them, like Mattachine, So they formed this group.
Say their names one more time.
Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon.
Phyllis Lyon.
Yeah.
Damn. Remember those names.
Right.
Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. Let's go, Phyllis.
Yep. So these gay male friends that they were complaining to introduced them to another lesbian couple. And we don't know both their names, but we do know one of their names. And it was a Filipina lesbian named Rosalie Bamberger. And she suggested to Del and Phyllis the secret social club idea, this lunch meeting for lesbians. In Martin and Lyon's words, they're quoted as saying women needed privacy, not only from the watchful eye of police, but from gaping tourists in the bars and inquisitive parents and families. So they created this sort of informal social group. But after a few meetings, they kind of decided that they really needed to sort of officially organize, right? So they created an official organization and they elected Del Martin as the president, the very first president of the Daughters of Bilitis.
Nice.
At their second official meeting is when they officially named the group the Daughters of Bilitis. And this name comes from a fictional poet named Bilitis, who was a contemporary to Sappho.
Hey, we learned about Sappho a few weeks ago.
We sure did. So now keep in mind, Bilitis was not a real person. She was a fictional character created by French poet Pierre Louis. But in these stories by Pierre Louis, she was a friend and contemporary of Sappho. And so it was kind of this secret nod to being like, hey, lesbian. And the word daughters was meant to kind of evoke this association with other American social organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution, right? So it's
clever.
You know, Daughters of Bilitis. It's like for those in the know, you know, this is a gay women's social club. But for those who aren't in the know, you just think it's another, you know, social activity club. For,
that's what you do in the 50s, is to have a bunch of social clubs. There's no internet, so you just get around and have a brunch.
Exactly. Remember when the internet didn't exist and you had to actually do things and hang out with people?
It was really nice. So what happened after that, Dany?
So within a year, the group's overall numbers had grown to about 16 members, I think.
Okay.
And even though most of the original 8 founding members at this time were no longer active, the group, you know, continued to grow and continue to operate. Around this time, they then kind of decided that they wanted to be more than just this like lunch meeting club. You know, they wanted to be more than just a social alternative to bars. They wanted to become, you know, more public, and they really wanted to organize and have an actual mission. And this caused some friction. There were a few members who, you know, were very uncomfortable about being more public.
Right. Some people, you know, wanted a revolution, and other people wanted to change it from the inside. You know, typical communists butting up against each other.
Yeah. So around this time, there were quite a few members that left. They ended up forming, you know, parallel but secret lesbian organizations. But the Daughters of Bilitis sort of restructured themselves, and they came up with a mission comprised in 4 parts. So part number 1 was education of those who were, you know, quote, variant, to enable women to understand herself and make her adjustment to society through the establishment of a library on the sex deviant theme, and by sponsoring public discussions conducted by leading members of, you know, legal, psychiatric, religious, and other professions, and by advocating a mode of behavior and dress acceptable to society. That's an important part. We're going to come back to that.
Acceptable. Make sure that you conform to the societal standards of heterosexual women.
Conformity was part of the, you know, their 4-part mission. So part 2 of their mission was education of the public by, you know, leading to an eventual breakdown of erroneous taboos and prejudices. General liberation of people who were different. Not just queer folks, but just, you know, in general, minorities.
Yep.
Part 3, they wanted to participate in research projects by duly authorized and responsible experts that were directed towards further knowledge of gay folks and homosexual sexuality. Honestly, a lot like what Magnus Hirschfeld was doing 20 years, 30 years, 40 years prior to this, right?
Before all of his research.
Exactly.
Right.
So, and then part 4 of their mission, they wanted to investigate the penal code as it pertains to gay folks and promote changes through due process of law in state legislatures, you know, try to actually change things. So it's a pretty solid lesbian organization. You know, they had some really good goals here. They also had some parts that I personally am not wild about, like that whole conformity thing, which...
Yeah, it was the 50s.
We're going to come back to that.
Well, I mean, you could also, like, you could argue about that, though, like, that it was passing.
Oh, yeah,
like,
100%.
Passing.
100% it was.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Okay, cool. We're on the same page.
Exactly. And look, like as a trans woman, I 100% get the impulse to, pass from, not just like a safety and security standpoint, which is probably one of the biggest reasons, but also just from convenience. It is exhausting to have to constantly defend your identity from, interrogation day in and day out. So being able to pass just so you don't have to deal with that, I get it. I 100% get it.
We at Seattle Voice Lab are calling it protective presentation now.
But at the same time, if you never introduce people to the alternative, then how do you ever expect them to accept the alternative? You know what I mean? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it can be kind of a catch-22, but like I get it. I get why conformity was so important to them.
Yeah.
So
and like passing is very different as well as like across time, across region or location. Like I have a couple students in Ecuador, and like passing is a totally different conversation than someone, here in Seattle.
Oh, sure.
Like it's totally different because the pressure of passing is so much greater than it is here in liberal city, Seattle,
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that they were, but what I find is like, what this tells me is that their mission of advocating for a mode of behavior and dress that's acceptable to society, that this mission was so important for them because the homophobia at that time was so great that this was literally included in their mission. Like, hey, we got to make sure that everyone in our society knows how to protect themselves through their presentation. Like that should tell you a lot, just like, and that's the same thing for the Mattachine, like unify homosexuals isolated from their own kind.
Yeah.
It's their number one goal, right? Like isolation is a huge part of Mattachine. Blending in is a huge part of the Daughters of Bilitis. Like these goals really do kind of identify what it was like during that time and what was important to these groups around then.
Sure.
And it's also really interesting to just see the gender differences too. And like, what that is like, education of the public by leading to an eventual breakdown of taboo and prejudice.
Yeah.
Like that's not a part of Mattachine's mission, but like lesbians definitely were pushing up against those taboos more so than gay men. Like at that time.
Well, even still to today.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Like adding conformity and this intent to pass into their mission really does speak to like the level of homophobia and vitriol that was there at the time, and I think the whole goal was to be like, let's get the straights to come around to being nice to us by showing them that we can be normal and not offensive to their sensibilities.
Right.
And in the 50s, I get that. But then as society progresses, that, while that was an important tactic early on, at some point it stops being enough.
It becomes a prison.
This episode of .fm is supported by our Patreon, duh. I mean, come on, you think a tiny trans podcast like us would have sponsors? I wish. No, we're supported entirely by our listeners. We're kind of like PBS that way, only queerer. Patreon.com/.femme. That's patreon.com/DOTFEMME. So, around this time, the mid-50s, both of these groups are experiencing this steady growth and really kind of celebrating it. Like national chapters for both Mattachine and the Daughters are forming across the country. Mattachine had chapters in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, DC, Chicago, even more, just across the country. There's so many that I can't name all of them. And the Daughters is, much the same way. But you also have to remember that at this time, the mid-50s and early 60s, this is in the middle of the Red Scare, right? Like the U.S. government is hunting down communists. And Mattachine and the Daughters are both very active during this point in time. So this is where we start to see some important things changing with Mattachine and the Daughters. So like we mentioned, a lot of the founders of Mattachine were card-carrying members of the Communist Party. And a lot of these founders started to become very concerned that the group's association with communism might hinder them pretty significantly. So the organization of the group really kind of goes through this metamorphosis, and they shift to be less influenced by communism and more focused specifically on gay civil rights, kind of narrowly focused. And even, Harry Hay, the founder, he approached the Communist Party leadership and recommended his own expulsion from the Communist Party.
What?
Yeah, well, because he didn't want his sexuality to negatively affect the Communist Party's goals. He's a card-carrying communist. He really believes in the Communist Party's mission, but he doesn't want to be a roadblock for them. So he recommends his own expulsion from the party. And the, Communist Party leadership agrees. So
you're no longer a communist, Harry.
Yeah, he's no longer a card-carrying communist, but he's still very communist. And after his quote expulsion, the Communist Party did honor him at like a secret banquet as like, a very notable friend of the party kind of thing.
I love the theater of this. No. I'm definitely not associated with the communists at all. No.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So, and also kind of because of all of this, kind of change happening in the society and dealing with, the Communist Party and the Red Scare and everything in 1952. So going back a couple years, but in 1952, there, was another split within the Mattachine Society where a few members left amicably, but they went to form their own group called One Incorporated.
Oh.
Yeah, and One still worked pretty closely with Mattachine. For instance, One and Mattachine Society helped the Daughters of Bilitis when they launched their magazine called The Ladder in 1956.
Nice.
A year after they formed. So
now we call it the glass ceiling.
Yeah. And, so Mattachine was pretty instrumental in helping the Daughters with their publication because they had their own publication that was pretty similar called the Mattachine Review. So, which both of these publications ended up growing to national readership over the next few years. So they were pretty important. In 1960, the Daughters held their first national convention in San Francisco and 200 women attended, which that's pretty good.
Wow.
That's a pretty good turnout for a, new kind of secret-ish gay women's association. In fact, even the San Francisco police showed up to the convention. Although I don't think they were actually there for the convention. They were trying to catch women cross-dressing, from those cross-dressing statutes. Same thing we saw happen at Stonewall. However, remember how we talked about one of their core missions was teaching women to dress appropriately? So when the police showed up, they were surprised that every woman in attendance was wearing dresses and stockings and heels, like high femme lesbians, 200 of them. Not what the police were expecting. So, and these women who attended the conference, they listened to a variety of speakers that this convention had, which included the ACLU. There was a debate between two lawyers about the legality and morality of gay bars. There was even an Episcopal priest who, served a, quote, damnation with dessert, literally telling them they're all going to hell for sinning, went on this tirade, and the women just, listened politely, took it in, and was okay. God. So
I want to hear the debate from the two lawyers.
Me too. Oh, man. That would have been so interesting.
Wild.
But yeah, standard kind of convention sort of thing. They even had an award ceremony where they gave awards to several men who were allied and helpful. Nice. And they called these male award recipients the Sons of Bilitis.
The SOBs.
SOBs.
Yep.
Super fun.
Love it.
They had a second convention 2 years later in 1962. And this one was particularly notable because it was covered on a nationally syndicated TV show. It was on the news across the country. And then from there on, they held conventions every 2 years until 1968. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's about 18 years or so of convention?
Well, 60 to 68, so 8 years of convention.
Yeah.
In 1961, the Mattachine Society, the National Mattachine Society, was disbanded due to a bunch of internal disagreements. But a lot of the local chapters still remained. They just didn't have an overarching national structure, unifying them all together anymore.
Right.
And in fact, the San Francisco chapter retained the name Mattachine Society, while the New York chapter, which I think was the second largest Mattachine chapter, they changed their name to Mattachine Society of New York, Incorporated, I guess, which seems to, I don't know what it is about this time, but tacking on incorporated seems to be really popular. I don't know if there's a legal reason for that or if it was just like in vogue to incorporate.
I mean, I don't know.
All I know is that when I think of Mattachine Society of New York Incorporated, I think of a crossover, but like a mashup of Queer Eye and Mad Men. And that's a show I'd watch, but
that would be pretty good. Mattachine only lasted 11 years, roughly.
Well, the national...
Yeah, I mean, there's, probably like pockets that lasted.
Yeah, the national organization, Mattachine Society, only lasted about 11 years. But like Mattachine Society itself still, goes on a little bit further. Okay. So in 1965 and 1966, Mattachine and the Daughters, kind of, disparate Mattachine chapters and the Daughters chapters, ended up holding pickets outside of a number of different federal buildings, including the White House, the State Department, a few others, mostly in Washington, D.C., but I think there were a couple in like Atlanta and New York. And they were, trying to have this more really kind of like visible in your face approach. Like they still, the men of Mattachine are still wearing like slacks and ties and button-up shirts. And the women are still, in dresses and stockings and stuff, but they're not just content to like sit in the living room anymore. They're like out there with signs and holding very polite, very conformist, but still public protest, Well,
also like the 60s started to become a little bit more rowdy as well. Like
that's
we started
true.
To see this with like hippie movements
and the anti-war movement of Vietnam. And it's all starting to kick off. Exactly. So this, more visible approach for the Daughters of Bilitis, at least also included a new regular column in their magazine, The Ladder, that they called Living Propaganda, where they urged women to come out to friends and family and to intentionally cause internal friction, in their communities to really kind of drive this conversation. But it kind of had this unintended consequence where it actually caused internal friction inside the Daughters group themselves, between those who wanted to be more visible and outspoken and public, and those who, wanted to maintain this conformist, make no waves, just show them we can be normal kind of approach, right?
Yeah, there's always that like fine line, I think, because like especially as times change, because like you want people, you want cis allies to like cis or heterosexual allies to be on your side. Right. And so sometimes that means like, conforming to their standards to better change their mind, or like another way to say it is like, in order to change someone's mind, you need to come down to their level, And it's like these sort of things I can kind of get behind of like why they were trying to do this. But also like, as I mentioned earlier, right, the 60s and the 70s started to become more rowdy. And like that idea of like, almost like being put, it probably would have felt like being put back into the closet at a certain point in time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, like you mentioned, like you said, coming down to their level to like change their minds. I think, there is a lot of really good value there as a starting point, but that's not where you want to, maintain.
You need to adapt. You need to, you need to iterate.
Exactly.
Because if you just stay there for too long, then like as mentioned earlier, it's like it becomes a prison in its own way where like nothing is getting done and everyone thinks that like, oh, you're just like us. And then you're just like us for a little too long. And then all of a sudden now it's almost erasure. Well, it is erasure.
Yeah.
So.
But when you think about like, if you're coming down to someone else's level, you're inherently on the back foot. Like by definition, you're coming down to their level, which is great to like introduce yourself and get the foot in the door. But it's not like being on the back foot is not a strong position to like maintain a cohesive front for change, right? It's a great way to get started, but eventually you're going to have to take a step forward so that you're on the front foot. And that was something that the Mattachine Society and the Daughters kind of, or at least parts of those groups seemed very unwilling to do, was take that next step forward. This kind of, refusal or resistance to like begin to push those boundaries is what really led to the decline that Mattachine and the Daughters began to experience in the latter half of the 1960s.
That's right.
Especially after events like Compton's and the Stonewall Uprising at the end of the 60s. These older homophile groups are increasingly becoming seen as too traditional, not willing to be confrontational enough. They're just, standing by and putting up with the police mistreatment and the harassment and all this kind of stuff. And so as you have this new, younger generation of activists growing up and entering the movement, these young new leaders start to feel that the gay rights movement needed to start to endorse larger and more radical agendas that address other forms of oppression. It's a very similar process to what happened to the civil rights movement as well when it first got started. It also experienced this kind of shift of younger activists coming in and feeling like they're not going far enough, right? So by 1967, the Mattachine Society functionally doesn't really exist anymore. I think there were a few local chapters still hanging on for dear life in a couple areas, but for the most part, Mattachine was dead by 1967.
I'm noticing a little bit of like a pattern, or maybe like some sort of parallels to like kind of what happened today. Like in 1967, Lyndon B. Johnson was president, right? And like this time, in politics was a little more liberal. And so, Kennedy was the president before then. And I wonder if like some of the things that we're seeing today about like this sort of like rebellion almost of like, queer people coming out and being like, no, we're not going to conform. We're not going to adapt. Has any sort of parallels with like the general consensus of the politics in the United States around those times?
Oh, I'm sure it does.
Do more people feel like, it's safer to fight? It's safer to put that, push forward when, the risk of being hate crimed or, victimized in some way, is less. We kind of saw that with Obama too, where, there was a huge queer, almost renaissance of sorts.
Yeah.
Tons of people were coming out, right? Gay people made huge strides for gay marriage with Obama.
It's like we talked about when Matt was on the podcast a couple episodes ago, how there's this, kind of ebb and flow of acceptance and then backlash and then acceptance and then backlash, and I think that this is that same pattern just happening, in a different sphere than television, but it's that same kind of thing.
So what happened in 1968, Dany?
So in 1968, editor of the Daughters of Bilitis magazine, The Ladder, she handed over editing duties to a woman named Barbara Greer, she'd been a contributing writer to The Ladder, since 1957, so like 11 years now. And Greer had really high aspirations for this magazine. And in an effort to try and attract new readers, she removed the subtitle A Lesbian Review from the cover of the magazine. And this was a very controversial move. There were a lot of members of the Daughters, lesbians across the country who were like, but that's our magazine. Why are you removing us from the cover?
Yeah, exactly.
It really started to set up this friction between Greer and a large contingent of the Daughters. But by 1970, Greer was really becoming convinced that the Daughters as an organization was falling apart. Mattachine was gone. The Daughters is kind of following that same pattern. She didn't want the organization falling apart to drag down the magazine itself. So she worked secretly with the president of the Daughters of Bilitis at the time, Rita Laporte, to take the publication's subscriber list from the Daughters headquarters in San Francisco to Reno, Nevada. And, this was a huge deal because originally, when the magazine was formed in 56, everyone that subscribed to the magazine was promised that the list was being kept confidential, that it was being kept only at headquarters, that, they were doing everything in their, power to make sure that the government didn't steal a copy and use that to come after them.
Wow.
So it was a pretty big deal when it left.
So how did it get leaked? Did someone say to the subscribers or like?
So a couple of members of the Daughters showed up one day and found that the list was missing. Because this is, before computers. So this was a physical list of subscribers.
God.
And,
this is probably, maybe thousands of people who are on this list as well.
I don't know. I didn't see a number associated with it, but it was, regardless.
We're talking about 20 years, 20 years at this point. So there's got to be tens of thousands of people on this list.
Probably at least hundreds, which is still, a lot of people that the government could round up if they had their hands on that list.
Yeah.
So it was, they were really concerned about making sure that the list was kept secure. So
Absolutely.
when the president of the organization and the new editor of their magazine kind of go rogue and make a copy of the list and then take both of these copies to Reno,
Nevada.
It's a big deal. And a couple members find that the list is missing, like it's physically gone. They physically drove it across state lines. So they just kind of assumed the FBI or the police had kind of broken in and confiscated it. And it was, people were terrified. It was a big deal.
I don't blame them.
And I think it was only a couple days before folks realized what had happened, because the president, was like, no, it's safe. We took it somewhere. But people weren't happy about that. Like the previous editors of the magazine, prior to Greer, considered this theft. Like this was high theft. But because Laporte, the president, and Greer had taken this publication over state lines, it now would have been considered a federal matter if they wanted to pursue it. And they didn't want to pursue that theft as a federal matter because, one, I think it just would have been too expensive. They didn't have the resources to do that.
Yep.
But two, it probably would have shown a really bright light on, the organization that they didn't necessarily want at this time. So they kind of dropped it, and Greer essentially severed ties with the organization as a whole. And this effectively took away the organization's main mode of communication among their members across the country. So kind of because of this, in 1970, 1971, the whole organization, Daughters of Bilitis, effectively kind of folded.
Wow.
And some local chapters, much like Mattachine, some local chapters hung on. They clung on for dear life, including a couple that existed all the way up to 1995. But the Daughters of Bilitis, was functionally dead around 1970. So, but in the wake of these organizations, they had spawned multiple feminist, lesbian, gay rights organizations. There's a historian, Martin Meeker, who described the 14-year influence of the Daughters of Bilitis specifically as they succeeded in linking hundreds of lesbians across the country with one another and gathering them into a distinctly modern communication network that was mediated through print and consequently imagination rather than sight, sound, smell, and touch. So they had a really profound impact, one that, while their particular chapter in the story of queer liberation was over, their, legacy is just getting started. Right. They had, these two groups had effectively spawned a movement that would go on. Harry Hay, the founder of Mattachine, is called the father of the gay liberation movement, and for good reason, right?
That's right. Yep.
Their legacy was pretty cemented. So I mean, it's a pretty important story. Yeah. So, and the complete surviving records of the Daughters of Bilitis are, in fact, kept at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, which I don't know if anyone remembers, but they actually helped me do research for the Comptons episode.
That's right.
So great organization. And then finally, I found this and thought it was pretty cool. But in 2011, a brand new Mattachine Society was formed in Washington, D.C., and it's dedicated to original archival research of queer political history specifically. So that's pretty neat. I don't know a ton about them beyond that, but I found that out and was like, oh, right on. So, kind of cool. Picking up the legacy of the original Mattachine Society 40 years later and running with it. That's pretty rad.
Yep, that is pretty rad.
Yeah.
And then, it's nice to know these organizations that are doing a lot of the archival work as well, to keep an eye on them for the future, especially at this time in our history.
Yep.
So this is amazing.
That's Mattachine and the Daughters.
I love it.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in and joining us down this exploration of the birth of US-based queer activism. So
I'm Claire.
if you like what we do here, you can find us on our website. You can find us on Blue Sky. You can support us financially on Patreon if you want to make sure that we can afford to keep bringing these awesome stories to you. So I know Spotify recently added comments to episodes. So should I say like, comment, and subscribe? Is that a thing people say for podcasts?
Yeah. Put it in the doobly-doo below.
Yeah. Like, comment, and subscribe. And with that, I've been your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
And I'm Claire.
And we will catch you next time.
Okay, no, but seriously, Danny,